In January 1915, fire from a single British shell was tearing through a German battlecruiser toward her magazines, and the valves that could stop it were already too hot to touch. The shell came in aft, a British 13.5-inch round, heavier than a small car, and when it punched into the rear of the ship on the afternoon of January 24th, 1915, it found the worst possible thing to hit: propellant. The big, silk-wrapped charges that flung Seydlitz's shells across the horizon were stacked and waiting near her two rear turrets, and the impact lit them. The propellant caught and burned, a wall of flame instead of a single blast. It roared up through the working chambers and the handling rooms, swallowing the men at their stations before most of them understood the ship had been hit at all. The two rear turrets were gutted in seconds. Whole gun crews simply ceased to exist. And the fire was still climbing. A propellant fire spreads. Where it goes is what matters. Below those burning turrets sat the main magazines, the great packed vaults of explosive that fed the guns, and if the flame reached them, the entire stern of Seydlitz would come apart in a single white flash. No wreck to salvage, no survivors, just a smear of smoke on the North Sea. Between that flame and the magazines stood one man, Pumpenmeister Wilhelm Heidkamp, a senior petty officer whose job was to manage the ship's pumps and flooding gear. The way to starve the fire was to ground the magazines, to crank open the flooding valves and let the sea pour in before the flame arrived. Heidkamp went for the valves. They were already red hot. The metal had soaked up the heat of the fire raging just beyond, and the hand wheels he needed to turn were glowing. He turned them anyway. He worked the valve with his bare hands while they seared his skin, and he kept working them until the seawater was rushing into the magazine spaces and the fire had nothing left to climb toward. Seydlitz settled, scorched and smoking, but afloat. She would limp home, and she would be rebuilt. What almost no one understood that day was that the ship had just been handed a gift, disguised as a catastrophe. The most dangerous thing about surviving Dogger Bank was how easily the German Navy could have learned nothing from it. Navies are very good at surviving disasters and then explaining them away. A ship nearly blows up, a board convenes, somebody writes that procedures were followed and equipment performed as designed, and everyone goes back to doing exactly what they always did. Seydlitz had every reason to become this kind of story. She'd been saved, and she came home. The fire was out. Case closed. Her captain would not let it close. Moritz von Egedy had watched 159 of his men burn over a single hit, and what enraged him was not the British gunnery. It was the discovery that his ship had nearly been lost, while everyone aboard did precisely what they had been trained to do. Later German accounts of the inquiry kept returning to that bitter phrase, that Seydlitz had almost gone down, quote, in accordance with regulations. The rules were the problem. The system had fed the fire. So the Germans tore the system apart and rebuilt it. The problem at Dogger Bank had been the propellant, sitting in the open, where a single spark could chain it together into one continuous river of flame from turret to magazine. The reforms went straight at that. Charges stopped being stacked in convenient piles near the guns. The doors and hatches between the magazines and the turrets were redesigned so that a fire in one space could not spread to the next. Crews drilled new habits for how a charge was passed hand to hand, never piling up, never giving the flame a road to follow. The lesson stopped being a paragraph in a report and became muscle memory in the hands of men who had buried their friends. And across the same gray sea, another navy was walking in the opposite direction. The Royal Navy prized speed of fire above almost everything. A British battlecruiser that could throw more shells per minute was a battlecruiser that won. And so the culture pushed the other way, toward charges brought up early and kept ready, toward anti-flash doors propped open because they slowed the guns down. Nobody had yet paid the bill for that. Seydlitz, meanwhile, kept getting hurt. Months after the rebuild, a mine tore into her during a raid on the English coast, and the damage was bad enough that the German fleet commander, Reinhard Scheer, refused to launch his great operation without her. He waited. The repairs were not finished until the very end of May 1916. She steamed out with the fleet, patched and reformed, and carried her hard-won lesson into the North Sea. Two navies, two opposite conclusions, one shell away from proving which was right. On May 31st, 1916, the test arrived at Jutland. The first hour of Jutland did not belong to the British. It belonged to Seydlitz. She had been rebuilt into something formidable, a battlecruiser of just over 28,000 tons, 200 meters of armored hull, 10 28-centimeter guns mounted in 5 twin turrets, capable of better than 26 knots. She'd been designed with one quirk worth remembering, a bow built higher than the German battlecruisers that came before her, because those earlier ships buried their noses in heavy seas and took water badly. The high forecastle made her drier and steadier. On the afternoon of May 31st, 1916, none of that was on anyone's mind. Seydlitz was hunting. She sailed with Admiral Franz Hipper's scouting force, third in line of German battlecruisers driving south into the North Sea. Hipper himself had shifted his flag to the newer Lutzow, but Seydlitz was no less lethal for it. When the British battlecruisers under David Beatty came up over the horizon, and the two scouting forces turned to run parallel, hammering at each other on converging courses, the gunnery the Germans had drilled so hard came into its own. This stretch of the fight became known as the Run to the South. The same fire discipline that had saved Seydlitz made her gunners deadly, because their charges came up clean, and their fire was steady and accurate. Seydlitz found HMS Queen Mary. Queen Mary was one of the finest battlecruisers in Beatty's line, 27,000 tons, 8 13.5-inch guns, the same caliber that had nearly sunk Seydlitz a year and a half before. Seydlitz and the German battlecruiser Döflinger bracketed her and poured in fire. Then, a little after 4 in the afternoon, a salvo found the magazines. Queen Mary bloomed into a burst of flame and flying debris. The men watching from nearby ships saw her vanish into a column of fire that rose hundreds of feet into the sky, her hull breaking as the magazines detonated. Of roughly 1,266 men aboard, fewer than 20 survived. Seydlitz had just done to Queen Mary what the British had nearly done to her, but it came at a price. Lesser ships would never have seen the sunrise after what Seydlitz absorbed in the next few hours. The British battlecruisers, and then the heavy guns of the Grand Fleet, found Seydlitz and began to take her apart, and the punishment arrived as a rhythm, a heavy shell every few minutes, hour after hour. A shell struck the right gun of one of her aft turrets, burst inside, and the propellant in the working chamber ignited. For an instant, it was Dogger Bank all over again, the same flame in the same kind of space, climbing toward the same magazines. This was the moment the ship had been rebuilt for. The reformed doors held. The flash did not run. The fire burned out a turret crew and stopped. Seydlitz lost the turret. She did not lose the ship. 4 of her 5 turrets were hit over the course of the battle. 2 of them set ablaze, and every single time, the fire stayed afire. A British battlecruiser in her position would already have been gone. Then, the torpedo. Somewhere in the chaos, a British torpedo found her hull and blew a hole in her below the waterline. Forward on the starboard side. She was burning, and now she was taking on water. Then the fighting reached the men running her. A heavy shell smashed into her forward superstructure and gutted the bridge, the cramped command space high in the ship, where her officers stood to con her through the battle. The forebridge was left a wreck, the upper works chewed open, and the splinters of her own command spaces would trail from her for the rest of the ordeal. By the time the battle let her go, the cost of staying in the line was written into her crew. Of the men aboard Seydlitz, 98 were lost and 55 wounded, most of them in a single afternoon. Set that beside the 159 from Dogger Bank, and the same ship had now buried more than 250 of her own in 2 battles. The accounts disagree on exactly how many shells she took. The figure most often given is 21 heavy caliber shells, 2 smaller ones, and a single torpedo. And through all of it, Seydlitz was still shooting. Battered, burning, and flooding, she fired 376 rounds from her main battery over the course of the battle. She was a wounded animal, still fighting back, still aimed at the enemy, still throwing shells across the water, even as the water came in through her side. The guns were the easy part. In the dark, between a half-wrecked Seydlitz and home, was the entire British fleet. When the guns finally fell silent and the short northern night came down, the 2 fleets did not break apart cleanly. The German fleet turned for home, and the route home ran straight across the path of the British, who lay between Scheer's ships and the safety of the German coast. Somewhere in that darkness, scorched and down by the bow, and trailing the wreckage of her own upper works, Seydlitz had to thread the gap. She was in no condition to fight her way through. A single fresh exchange of fire would have finished her. Her only weapon now was darkness, and the hope that to a British lookout she would read as just another shadow in a night full of them. Around 1:45 in the morning on June 1st, Seydlitz came up close to the British battleship Agincourt, a monster carrying 14 heavy guns, more than any other ship in either fleet. Agincourt's people saw her. A lookout reported a ship, or possibly a destroyer, off in the dark, close enough to matter. For a moment, the whole crawl home hung on what one British captain decided to do in the next few seconds. He held his fire. By 1:10 a.m., Seydlitz was through the line. The trap had not closed. But getting through the British was only half the night's problem, because Seydlitz could barely tell where she was going. Both of her gyro compasses had failed. The great steel ship was loose in the dark, in waters seeded with minefields and shoals, half blind, and around 3:30 in the morning, she scraped across the shallows of Horn's Reef and kept going. From that point on, she could not be trusted to navigate on her own. The light cruiser Pillau took station on her and led her by hand, a smaller, whole ship nursing a larger broken one through the dark toward home. She had slipped the trap, but the British were no longer the enemy that mattered. The enemy now was the water, and it was already inside her. By the afternoon of June 1st, the only thing keeping 1,100 men alive was a single flooded compartment that was never meant to float anything. The water had been winning for hours. It came in through the torpedo hole, yes, but that was only the open door. Once the sea was inside, it went looking for every other way forward, and a ship hit 24 times has a great many ways. It pushed through hatches sprung out of true by the shock of the hits, seeped along leaking ventilation ducts and down speaking tubes, found seams that had opened and rivets that had sheared, and worked its way compartment to compartment. The men of Seydlitz spent the daylight hours of June 1st in a losing fight against it, stuffing holes, shorting up bulkheads, chasing the sea through cable runs and around the shafts of screws and nuts. Then the pumps betrayed them. Seydlitz carried large-capacity pumps built for exactly this, to throw hundreds of tons of water back over the side. They were useless. The valves controlling them could only be reached from a compartment already underwater. The crew was left fighting a flood with whatever they could carry. 2 portable pumps, a so-called colonial pump, and when that was not enough, the ship's drinking water pump pressed into service to bail out the sea. A battlecruiser was being kept afloat by the kind of equipment you would use to empty a basement. And the bow was going under. As the forward compartment filled, Seydlitz settled by the head, and her bow was nearly awash, the sea climbing the deck toward the forward turret. Forward of the worst flooding, one space stubbornly refused to give up. The broadside torpedo room, built to launch torpedoes out through the hull, was sealed enough to hold its air, and as everything around it drowned, it became the last real pocket of buoyancy at the front of the ship. The crew came to think of it as exactly what it was, a swimming bladder. The single trapped breath of air held the ship's nose off the bottom of the North Sea. and the thing keeping her from going down faster was the part of her nobody had ever thought about. That high bow, built years before to keep her dry in heavy seas, was now a reserve buoyancy in the one place she needed it most, lifting where the water was heaviest. It still was not enough to simply steam home. Driving the wrecked bow forward shoved the sea hard against the strained forward bulkheads, the last barriers holding the flood out of the rest of the ship, and they could not take it. So Seydlitz did something strange. At times, she turned and worked astern, backing toward home to take the pressure off her own failing bulkheads, crawling at 3 or 4 knots, whether she went bow first or stern first. The crew had done everything human hands could do. It was not going to be enough. If Seydlitz was going to live, the sea itself would have to be tricked. What happened next came down to a borrowed pump steamer, a slick of oil, and a tide that would not be hurried. There was no dramatic rescue, no tow line snapping taut and hauling her clear. 2 pump steamers, Boreas and Craft, came alongside the wreck to help fight the water her own pumps could no longer manage. The light cruiser Pillau, which had guided her through the dark, positioned herself to make a lee, putting her own hull between Seydlitz and the weather, so the battered ship sat in calmer water. And then Craft laid an oil slick on the sea around Seydlitz. Oil flattens water. A film of it on the surface smooths the chop and stops waves from breaking. And for a ship whose bow was nearly awash, every wave that broke over the forward deck was more weight she could not afford, and more strain on bulkheads already failing. By calming the surface, Craft took one of the sea's weapons out of its hands. The fleet was pumping her out and physically smoothing the ocean in front of her. Even then, she could not simply sail into port. By June 2nd, she lay near the outer Jade light vessel, off the German coast, and she had to wait, because her bow had sunk so deeply that her forward draft was enormous. She needed the tide to lift her over the shallows on the way in. At dawn on June 3rd, she got it. Seydlitz came up to the docks at Wilhelmshaven in the early morning, low and broken and barely recognizable. And from the battleships anchored there, from the crews lining the rails, came the hurrahs, rolling across the water to greet a ship that every man watching knew had no business still being afloat. Navy photographers recorded her in dock for the cameras, listed over to port, bow drowned, the guns of her forward turret stripped away, a ship that looked less like a survivor than like something dragged up from the seabed. She had crawled home alive against everything the sea could throw at her. It was an incredible victory. Yet Jutland is remembered as a battle Germany lost. This was because she should not have lived. She survived only because of how she was built. Heavy armor, tight compartmentalization, and that high bow that gave her buoyancy where it counted. She survived because of how she was run. The flash discipline forced through after Dogger Bank, the reformed doors and drilled habits that turned magazine apocalypses into survivable turret fires. And she survived because of who served in her, a crew that fought the water for 3 days with portable pumps and bare hands and would not stop. Steel, doctrine, and men. The Germans inflicted heavier losses at Jutland, sank more ships, and took down more men, yet they did not break the thing they had sailed out to break. The British fleet was bruised, and it was still there, still astride the North Sea, still strangling Germany with its blockade exactly as before. Scheer himself, who had commanded the German fleet that day, understood it. In the aftermath, he conceded that no single fleet battle, however well fought, would knock Britain out of the war. The road to victory at sea, if there was one, ran instead through the U-boat, and within months, Germany would gamble the whole war on unrestricted submarine warfare.